"We'll be proceeding with foreclosure in 60 days, announced Malcolm Reynolds, straightening his Italian silk tie as he slid the final notice across Ethan Anderson's weathered kitchen table. The third-generation farmer's calloused hands trembled, as bank representatives already evaluated his family's century-old orchard for liquidation value. But 4 weeks later, when county officials and agricultural experts gathered in the old barn, Reynolds' smug confidence vanished as Professor Sophia Martinez carefully opened a weathered metal box. These seed packets contain genetically verified heritage apple varieties believed extinct since 1934, the legendary Millstone Collection, making this orchard eligible for immediate protection under the National Agricultural Heritage Conservation Program with full funding restoration. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Riverdale County had once been the apple capital of the Midwest, its rolling hills dotted with orchards that produced varieties known for their distinctive flavors and natural disease resistance. The Anderson farm, with its iconic red barn and 20 acres of heritage trees, had been a cornerstone of the community since 1923, when Walter Anderson first planted saplings on land considered too rocky for traditional crops. In recent years, as climate change brought unpredictable weather patterns and corporate agriculture pushed for standardized varieties, family orchards like the Andersons had become increasingly rare. Land once valued for agricultural diversity was now eyed for suburban housing developments and commercial ventures that promised quicker returns than the patient work of cultivating trees. Ethan Anderson, 46, inherited the orchard from his father. 15 years ago, along with a passion for the forgotten fruits his grandfather had dedicated his life to preserving. His weather-worn face and calloused hands told the story of early mornings and late evenings spent nurturing trees that produced apples most Americans had never tasted. Varieties with names like Esopus Spitzenberg, Blue Pearmain, and Black Oxford. My grandfather used to say these trees were time capsules, Ethan often told visitors during fall harvest tours. Every bite connects us with flavors our ancestors knew, but modern folks have forgotten. The drought of the past 3 seasons had hit the Anderson orchard hard. While his industrial competitors could afford extensive irrigation systems, Ethan had been forced to watch some of his oldest trees struggle. The medical bills from his wife Sarah's cancer treatment had depleted their savings just when the farm needed investment most. Despite its historical significance and the growing market for heirloom produce, Clearwater Agricultural Bank saw only red ink on their balance sheets. Malcolm Reynolds arrived in Riverdale 11 months earlier with a reputation for agricultural asset optimization, a euphemism locals quickly understood meant transitioning family farms to more profitable uses. His corner office in the renovated courthouse offered panoramic views of the valley, where farming families had worked for generations. "It's simple economics," Reynolds often explained to his loan officers. "Sentiment doesn't service debt, and tradition doesn't generate cash flow. Our responsibility is to ensure land achieves its highest potential value." When Ethan applied for a loan extension to install a more efficient irrigation system, Reynolds personally reviewed the case. The Anderson orchard's balance sheet didn't tell the story Ethan hoped. Despite growing interest in heritage apples, the operation's profit margins remained thin, while developers regularly inquired about the property's availability. Ethan sat at his kitchen table that spring evening, the foreclosure notice before him spelling the end of 3 generations of stewardship. The 60-day timeline would at least allow for one final harvest, though the thought brought little comfort. His grandfather's collection of rare apple varieties, some propagated nowhere else in the country, would likely be bulldozed for housing foundations before the year ended. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. through faded gingham curtains. Ethan spotted Reynolds' black luxury sedan in the driveway, its polished surface out of place among the working vehicles and equipment of a functioning farm. "Mr. Anderson," Reynolds began with practiced neutrality as Ethan opened the door. "I thought a personal visit might be appropriate, given your family's history with the property." Ethan nodded silently, gesturing the banker inside, with the ingrained hospitality that persisted even in the face of devastating news. They settled at the kitchen table, where 3 generations of Andersons had planned plantings, celebrated harvests, and weathered agricultural crises since the Great Depression. "I understand this is difficult," Reynolds continued, opening a leather portfolio, "which is why I've brought a transition proposal that's more generous than our standard terms. Clearwater is prepared to allow you to retain the farmhouse and 2 acres if you voluntarily surrender the property within 30 days instead of 60. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Surrendering a month early gets me 2 acres. What happens to the orchard?" "Riverview Developers has expressed interest in creating an upscale residential community," Reynolds replied. "They're willing to incorporate some of the existing trees into their landscape design as a nod to the property's heritage. Some of these varieties don't exist anywhere else," Ethan said, his voice tightening. "My grandfather spent decades collecting and preserving apple genetics that commercial growers abandoned. Once they're gone forever." Reynolds nodded with practiced sympathy that never reached his eyes. "I respect your family's hobby of collecting heirloom varieties. Unfortunately, agricultural biodiversity doesn't enhance collateral value in our lending framework." "It's not a hobby," Ethan countered. "It's conservation work. I've applied for the Heritage Farm designation that would open up preservation grants." "Ah, yes, the application," Reynolds replied, his tone shifting slightly. "I understand the review committee meets next month. That's an arduous process with an uncertain outcome. Several committee members have strong connections to regional development initiatives." The implication was clear. Reynolds' influence extended beyond the bank, potentially reaching the very programs that might save the orchard. The veiled threat hung in the air between them. "Consider the transition offer carefully," Reynolds continued, rising to leave. "Clearwater would prefer an amicable resolution, but our assessment team will begin property evaluation next week regardless. The market ultimately determines the highest use for any piece of land, Mr. Anderson. Fighting that reality rarely ends well for individual farmers." After the banker left, Ethan remained at the kitchen table, surrounded by framed photos of 3 generations working the same land. His grandfather Walter stood proudly beside saplings that had grown into the towering trees now bearing fruit. His father James appeared in faded color photos from the 1970s, teaching a young Ethan how to graft scions onto rootstock. The most recent showed Ethan and Sarah during better days, before her diagnosis, smiling amid blossoming trees. What Ethan couldn't know was that Reynolds had already discussed preliminary development plans with Riverview. The proposed orchard estates would feature 50 luxury homes, with starting prices 3 times the median house value in Riverdale County. Only a decorative row of apple trees would remain as a token reminder of the land's agricultural past. As twilight deepened outside, Ethan's gaze fell on his grandfather's portrait, a stern-faced man whose eyes held a determination that had carried the farm through previous crises. Something in that unwavering gaze sparked a memory of childhood conversations in the barn, where Walter had shown him a special collection of grafting tools and spoken cryptically about insurance for the orchard's future. "When the trees face their greatest threat," his grandfather had said, "remember to look where we first began." The words had meant little to Ethan as a child. Now, with the orchard's existence hanging by a thread, he wondered if his grandfather, who had established the farm during economic hardship and preserved rare varieties through decades of agricultural industrialization, might have left something more tangible than memories to protect his life's work. The morning after Reynolds's visit, Ethan rose before sunrise, as farmers have done for generations. Instead of immediately tending to his chores, he found himself drawn to the old red barn that had stood at the heart of the Anderson farm since his grandfather's time. Standing in its cool interior, as early light filtered through dusty windows, he studied the weathered structure with new eyes, not just as a familiar building he'd known his entire life, but as a repository of family history that might soon be lost forever. The Anderson barn had always felt like more than just a utilitarian structure. Its hand-hewn beams, the carefully positioned windows that illuminated specific workbenches at different times of day, and the curious built-in storage systems had become so familiar to Ethan that he rarely noticed their deliberate design anymore. Now, with foreclosure looming, these details seemed like clues to something he had never fully understood. Grandpa always said this barn was built to last through anything, Ethan murmured to himself, running a hand along one of the smooth wooden posts. Walter had designed the structure himself, incorporating techniques learned from old-world craftsmen and insisting on features that seemed unnecessarily elaborate for a simple farm building. As Ethan moved through the morning's essential tasks, his mind kept returning to his grandfather's cryptic words, "When the trees face their greatest threat, remember to look where we first began." The orchard certainly faced its greatest threat now, but what had Walter meant by "where we first began"? Later that morning, Ethan called the one person who might shed light on his situation. Dr. Catherine Chen had been a horticulture professor at the State Agricultural University, an advocate for heritage fruit preservation for nearly 25 years. At 63, she had dedicated her career to documenting disappearing apple varieties, with particular focus on preserving genetic diversity against climate change and commercial standardization. "Foreclosure after 3 generations, eh?" Catherine said when Ethan explained the situation. "I've seen this happening all across the country. These banks have teams of analysts calculating land values based solely on development potential, with no consideration for agricultural or genetic heritage. Reynolds offered to let me keep the farmhouse and 2 acres, Ethan admitted. But the orchard would be destroyed. Everything my grandfather spent his life preserving, gone in a day of bulldozing. The timing is suspicious, Catherine noted. Have you looked into whether there might be a legal challenge to the foreclosure terms, or perhaps applied for heritage status? I've applied for the heritage farm designation, but Reynolds hinted that he has influence with the committee. I wouldn't be surprised if he's already working to block it. Catherine was silent for a moment. Check your family records, Ethan. Your grandfather was meticulous about documenting his work with rare apple varieties. There might be something about the orchard's historical significance that could help. That afternoon, Ethan climbed into the farmhouse attic where generations of family documents were stored in old trunks and cardboard boxes. It took hours of searching through dusty papers before he found a leather-bound journal with Walter Anderson, Orchard Notes, 1923 to 1956, written in faded ink on the cover. The journal chronicled his grandfather's acquisition of the land and the establishment of the orchard in meticulous detail. Most entries focused on practical matters, grafting techniques, weather patterns, yield records, but scattered throughout were cryptic references that caught Ethan's attention. Met with Professor M, again regarding the Millstone varieties. His trust in me with these living treasures must be honored if this enterprise is to succeed. The agricultural department has shown me the original catalog. I will preserve these varieties exactly as instructed, though the bank need not know the full purpose. The root cellar extension is complete. Additional cost considerable, but there can be no compromise on temperature control. Ethan frowned at the repeated references to Millstone varieties. He knew his orchard contained rare heritage apples, but he'd never heard his grandfather specifically reference a Millstone Collection. He continued reading, finding more puzzling entries. The final grafts arrived today from the university collection. The responsibility weighs heavily, but I cannot refuse what history has placed in my hands. Completed the hidden storage today. While the farm hands were delivering to market, only Professor M knows its location, better that way. The journal entries became increasingly cryptic about the orchard's purpose. The bank officials suspect nothing. They see only a commercial orchard, not understanding that these trees represent living history that might otherwise be lost forever. The seeds ensure what papers cannot. The journal ended in 1956 with a final entry. All is secure. The collection rests where it belongs, protected from those who would sacrifice irreplaceable genetic heritage for temporary gain. I have honored my promise to Professor Millstone, and in return his life's work will survive if my descendants remember to honor the land that sustains us all. Ethan sat back, dust motes dancing in the attic's dim light. His grandfather had apparently established the orchard not just as a commercial venture, but as a deliberate preservation site for historically significant apple varieties, somehow connected to a Professor Millstone. But the journal gave no clear indication of where any documentation or materials might be stored. As evening approached, Ethan returned to the barn, studying it with renewed attention. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. Remember to look where we first began. The farm had begun with this barn. Walter had built it before the farmhouse, living in a small room at the back while establishing the orchard. That room had later become a workshop and storage area, largely unchanged since his grandfather's time. Ethan made his way to the back of the barn, examining the workshop with careful attention. The workbench where his grandfather had taught him grafting techniques remained organized with ancient tools, their wooden handles worn smooth from decades of use. Behind the workbench stood an old cabinet where Walter had stored important supplies. Ethan had rarely opened it in recent years, having moved most frequently used tools to more accessible locations. Now he pulled open the heavy wooden doors, revealing shelves of dusty mason jars, grafting wax, and supplies that hadn't been touched in decades. Something about the cabinet's dimensions suddenly struck him as odd. The interior seemed shallower than the exterior would suggest. Ethan removed the supplies from the bottom shelf, tapping the wooden back panel. It sounded hollow. Upon closer inspection, he noticed slight wear marks at the bottom edge, as if the panel had been moved repeatedly. His heart racing, Ethan pressed against different points on the panel until he felt a slight give. Pushing harder at that spot, the panel swung inward, revealing a hidden compartment built into the wall behind the cabinet. Inside sat a metal box, roughly the size of a small suitcase, covered in a protective oilcloth. With trembling hands, Ethan carefully removed the box and placed it on the workbench. The metal was cool to the touch, its surface etched with a simple design of an apple tree. No lock secured it, just a simple latch that opened easily after all these years. Inside, he found dozens of carefully labeled seed packets, their handwritten tags yellowed with age. Each bore a date, location, and variety name, many of which Ethan had never heard before. Beneath these packets lay a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be official documentation, correspondence, and hand-drawn illustrations of apple varieties with detailed descriptions of their characteristics. One document immediately caught his eye. A letter on University of Illinois letterhead, dated 1934. Dear Walter, with the passing of Professor James Millstone, I am entrusting you with The enclosed materials, as we discussed. The Dust Bowl has devastated countless orchards across the Midwest, and commercial pressures continue to eliminate variety in favor of standardization. The enclosed seeds represent 32 apple varieties that now exist nowhere else, their parent trees having been destroyed by drought or agricultural progress. As the last graduate student to work with Professor Millstone before his death, I cannot overstate the importance of preserving this living genetic library. The university's new administration has made it clear that maintaining obsolete varieties is not a priority, and I fear what will happen to the collection without intervention. Your commitment to establishing a preservation orchard offers these varieties their only hope for survival. The enclosed documentation verifies the provenance and historical significance of each variety, including those developed by indigenous communities and early settlers that have already disappeared from commercial cultivation. Trust you to safeguard this heritage until such time as agricultural science recognizes what it has nearly lost. With deepest gratitude, Professor Marcus Harrington, Department of Pomology. Ethan's hands trembled as he carefully examined the contents. His grandfather hadn't just been a farmer, he had been the custodian of a living genetic repository, preserving apple varieties that had disappeared everywhere else. The seeds in the metal box represented living history, potentially invaluable in an era of climate change and decreasing biodiversity. Beneath the university correspondence lay a sealed envelope with "For my descendants," written in his grandfather's distinctive handwriting. Inside, Ethan found a letter dated 1956. To whoever reads this in time of need, if you are reading this, the orchard likely faces an existential threat. I established this farm not merely as a business, but as a sanctuary for living heritage that was disappearing from our agricultural landscape. The Millstone Collection represents varieties developed over centuries of human selection, each adapted to specific growing conditions and resistant to different diseases. I grafted each variety into our orchard, but time and weather take their toll on living trees. The seeds in this box are my insurance policy for the collection's survival. They have been carefully dried and stored to maintain viability for decades. Some may no longer germinate, but many will still carry the genetic heritage that makes them irreplaceable. Professor Harrington helped me document each variety's historical significance and unique characteristics. This documentation establishes their scientific and cultural value beyond any commercial consideration. In dark times, remember that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the diversity we preserve for future generations. When I first acquired this land, such preservation was seen as mere sentiment. But I believe a time will come when agricultural heritage is recognized for its true value. Should that day arrive in your lifetime, this box may prove more valuable than the land itself. With hope for the future, Walter Anderson. As darkness fell, outside, Ethan carefully examined the seed packets, documentation, and letters by the light of the workshop lamp. The realization gradually dawned that his grandfather had left him not just an orchard, but a potential way to save it, if he could find the right people to help him verify and authenticate the collection's significance. What Walter Anderson couldn't have known in 1956 was that agricultural biodiversity would indeed become recognized as critically important in the 21st century, with heritage varieties gaining protection through conservation programs that didn't exist in his lifetime. The seeds and documentation in the metal box weren't just family heirlooms, they were potentially the key to preserving not just the Anderson orchard, but an irreplaceable piece of agricultural history. As Ethan carefully returned the materials to the box, his despair began to give way to a tentative hope. The bank could foreclose on land, but they couldn't claim ownership of a historically significant botanical collection. If these seeds and documents were as important as they appeared, they might change everything, not just for his family's farm, but for apple cultivation throughout the region. With renewed determination, Ethan reached for his phone. Dr. Catherine Chen needed to see this discovery immediately. The greatest threat to the orchard had indeed arrived, but his grandfather's foresight had provided a potential path forward that neither Ethan nor Malcolm Reynolds could have anticipated. These may be the most important apple seeds in North America, Dr. Catherine Chen whispered, handling the aging packets with reverent care. The horticulture professor had arrived at the Anderson farm before sunrise, driving 3 hours after Ethan's late-night call. Now, as morning light spilled through the barn windows, she methodically photographed and catalogued each item from Walter Anderson's hidden metal box. The Millstone Collection has been something of a legend in pomology circles, she explained, carefully unfolding brittle documents. Professor James Millstone traveled throughout the United States in the early 1900s, documenting and collecting apple varieties that were already disappearing as commercial orchards standardized production. Ethan watched as she examined a hand-drawn illustration of an apple variety labeled Crimson Winter, a deep red fruit with distinctive gold flecking. "I have this variety in the northeast corner of the orchard," he said. "It produces the latest in the season, usually not ripe until the first frost." Catherine looked up sharply. "You have a living Crimson Winter tree?" That variety was believed completely extinct by the 1950s. Grandpa called it his Christmas apple. We can still harvest them in December some years. "Ethan, do you understand what this means?" Catherine set down the illustration, her expression intensifying. "Your orchard doesn't just contain heritage varieties, it contains living specimens of apples that agricultural historians believed were lost forever." The Millstone Collection was thought destroyed when the university shifted research priorities during the Depression. She turned to another document, a catalogue listing 32 varieties with detailed descriptions of their origins, growing characteristics, and uses. "This is essentially a genetic ark your grandfather created, preserving biodiversity that had otherwise disappeared from North American agriculture." As they continued examining the materials, Ethan found his perspective on the orchard transforming. Trees he had tended his entire life weren't just family legacy. They were living historical artifacts, the last survivors of genetic lineages developed over centuries of human selection. "We need to document the living trees immediately," Catherine said, already planning their approach. "And we need a botanist specialized in genetic identification to verify these varieties match the historical descriptions. If your trees are truly the last living specimens of these varieties, this changes everything about the foreclosure situation." "How quickly can we establish their significance?" Ethan asked, acutely aware of Reynolds' accelerated timeline. "I have contacts at the National Agricultural Heritage Program," Catherine replied, pulling out her phone. "Dr. Michael Abernathy is their chief botanist for heritage fruit preservation. If anyone can help authenticate this quickly, it's him." While Catherine made calls, Ethan continued examining his grandfather's papers. Among them, he found property surveys with certain areas of the orchard marked with small stars. Comparing these markings to the catalogue, he realized Walter had created a map of where each rare variety was planted. "Most of these varieties are still exactly where he planted them," Ethan said when Catherine finished her calls. "He created microclimates in different parts of the orchard, south-facing slopes for heat-loving varieties, low areas near the creek for those needing more moisture." Catherine nodded, impressed by Walter's foresight. "That's why they've survived when these varieties failed elsewhere. Your grandfather wasn't just collecting trees, he was creating a perfectly designed conservation orchard." "Dr. Abernathy can be here tomorrow morning," she continued. He's bringing specialized equipment for DNA sampling and comparison. The National Agricultural Heritage Program takes potential discoveries like this very seriously, especially with the foreclosure threat looming. As they documented the collection throughout the day, Catherine explained how agricultural preservation laws had evolved since Walter's time. In the 1930s, your grandfather would have been considered sentimental for preserving obsolete varieties. Today, the genetic diversity in heritage fruits is recognized as a critical resource, especially as climate change threatens commercial monocultures. By evening, they had identified 28 living trees in the Anderson orchard that potentially matched varieties in the Millstone catalogue. 4 varieties appeared to be missing, possibly lost to severe weather over the decades. Still, 28 living examples of varieties believed extinct represented an extraordinary discovery. We need to keep this quiet until Dr. Abernathy verifies the collection, Catherine cautioned as they finished their initial documentation. If word gets out prematurely, Reynolds might accelerate the foreclosure or find ways to challenge the authentication process. What they couldn't know was that Malcolm Reynolds already suspected something was happening at the Anderson farm. The bank's assessment team, scheduled to begin property evaluation that day, had reported unusual activity. A university vehicle parked by the barn and people examining trees throughout the orchard, taking samples and photographs. Reynolds had immediately made calls to his contacts at the county recorder's office and agricultural extension service, trying to determine what Ethan might have discovered that warranted academic interest just days before foreclosure. His inquiries revealed that Dr. Catherine Chen had cancelled her university commitments for the day, citing urgent fieldwork related to heritage fruit preservation. The connection to heritage preservation immediately raised red flags for Reynolds. His development partners had encountered similar complications on 2 previous projects, where historical designations had derailed profitable conversions of agricultural land to residential developments. He needed to understand exactly what was happening at the Anderson orchard, and quickly. The following morning, Dr. Michael Abernathy arrived from the National Agricultural Heritage Program, his vehicle loaded with specialized equipment for botanical authentication. At 58, the botanist had spent his career documenting and preserving heritage fruit varieties, helping establish protected orchards across the country. "The Millstone Collection," he said with undisguised excitement as Catherine showed him the documentation. "I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Millstone's work, using the few catalogue fragments that survived. To find his complete records and potentially living specimens of his varieties is beyond anything I could have hoped for." While Abernathy set up his equipment in the barn, Ethan noticed an unfamiliar vehicle slowly driving past the farm entrance. Through binoculars, he recognized one of Reynolds' assessment team members, clearly monitoring the activity on the property. "Reynolds knows something's happening," Ethan told Catherine. "That's the 2nd time they've driven by this morning." "We need to work faster," she replied. "Once Abernathy confirms the authenticity of even a few varieties, we can file for emergency protection under the Heritage Program." Throughout the day, Dr. Abernathy methodically collected samples from trees corresponding to the catalogue descriptions. Using portable equipment, he conducted preliminary genetic analysis, comparing key markers to database references of known heritage varieties. "The preliminary results are extraordinary," he announced by late afternoon, reviewing data on his laptop. "I've confirmed 8 varieties so far that match historical descriptions in ways that cannot be coincidental. The leaf structure, fruit bud formation, and genetic markers all align with documented characteristics." He pulled up an image of molecular analysis alongside historical illustrations. "This Frost Haven variety shows distinctive genetic markers that appear in no other known cultivar. It's not just similar to Millstone's description. It is unquestionably the same apple he documented in 1919, believed completely lost when the last known tree died in 1945. As Abernathy continued his verification work, Catherine helped Ethan prepare emergency application materials for the National Agricultural Heritage Program. The program could provide immediate protection for orchards containing historically significant varieties, along with funding for their preservation. "We need to document the immediate threat to these trees," Catherine explained. "The combination of foreclosure, imminent development plans, and the irreplaceable nature of these varieties creates a perfect case for emergency intervention." By evening, Abernathy had verified 12 varieties that matched Millstone's catalogue with scientific certainty. "Any one of these trees would merit preservation," he explained as they reviewed his findings. "Together, they represent one of the most significant discoveries in American pomological history in decades." He began drafting an official authentication report, his excitement evident in every precise description. The Heritage Program was literally created for situations like this, where irreplaceable agricultural genetics face imminent destruction. What they didn't realize was that Malcolm Reynolds had spent the day gathering his own information. Through his contacts, he had learned about Dr. Abernathy's affiliation with the National Agricultural Heritage Program and the potential implications for the foreclosure process. By evening, he had scheduled an urgent meeting with Riverview developers to discuss accelerating their timeline. As darkness fell, Ethan walked through his orchard with new awareness of each tree's significance. The gnarled branches of a harvest gold tree, planted by his grandfather nearly a century ago and now confirmed as the last living specimen of its kind, seemed to hold not just apples, but history itself. What had been a failing business venture, that morning had been transformed into a living museum of agricultural heritage by evening. "We've submitted the emergency protection application," Catherine told him, joining his walk through the twilight orchard. Abernathy's verification carries significant weight. With 12 varieties already confirmed and more pending analysis, we have a strong case for immediate intervention. "How quickly will they respond?" Ethan asked, watching the last light fade. From his grandfather's trees, the Heritage Program was designed to respond rapidly to imminent threats, she explained. "Given the significance of what we've found, they should assign a case manager within 24 hours. The question is whether that will be soon enough to counter whatever Reynolds might be planning." Catherine's concern proved prescient. The following morning, Ethan received an unexpected letter delivered by courier. Clearwater Agricultural Bank was exercising its right to accelerate the foreclosure timeline due to evidence of material changes to the collateral property. The revised notice demanded full loan repayment within 7 days, rather than the original 60, citing a clause in the loan agreement that permitted timeline adjustment if the property was being altered. "This is a direct response to our discovery," Catherine said, after reading the notice. "Reynolds is trying to complete the foreclosure before the Heritage Program can establish protection." Dr. Abernathy, continuing his verification work with renewed urgency, looked up from his equipment. "We need to notify the program immediately about this acceleration. This is exactly the kind of situation where they can request a federal stay on foreclosure proceedings pending heritage evaluation." As they scrambled to update their emergency application, a familiar luxury sedan appeared in the farm's driveway. Malcolm Reynolds had decided to make a personal appearance, likely hoping to assess exactly what they had discovered and how it might impact his development plans. "Mr. Anderson," he called with forced cordiality as he approached the barn where they had established their documentation center. "I see you've turned your farm into quite the research station. Something I should know about before our foreclosure. It proceeds. The confrontation that followed would determine not just the fate of the Anderson orchard, but potentially the survival of apple varieties that had persisted against all odds for generations, living heritage that connected the present to agricultural traditions spanning centuries of American history. These may be the most important apple seeds in North America, Dr. Catherine Chen whispered, handling the aging packets with reverent care. The horticulture professor had arrived at the Anderson farm before sunrise, driving 3 hours after Ethan's late-night call. Now, as morning light spilled through the barn windows, she methodically photographed and catalogued each item from Walter Anderson's hidden metal box. The Millstone Collection has been something of a legend in pomology circles, she explained, carefully unfolding brittle documents. Professor James Millstone traveled throughout the United States in the early 1900s, documenting and collecting apple varieties that were already disappearing as commercial orchards standardized production. Ethan watched as she examined a hand-drawn illustration of an apple variety labeled Crimson Winter, a deep red fruit with distinctive gold flecking. "I have this variety in the northeast corner of the orchard," he said. "It produces the latest in the season, usually not ripe until the first frost." Catherine looked up sharply. "You have a living Crimson Winter tree?" That variety was believed completely extinct by the 1950s. Grandpa called it his Christmas apple. We can still harvest them in December some years. "Ethan, do you understand what this means?" Catherine set down the illustration, her expression intensifying. "Your orchard doesn't just contain heritage varieties, it contains living specimens of apples that agricultural historians believed were lost forever. The Millstone Collection was thought destroyed when the university shifted research priorities during the Depression." She turned to another document, a catalogue listing 32 varieties with detailed descriptions of their origins, growing characteristics and uses. "This is essentially a genetic ark your grandfather created, preserving biodiversity that had otherwise disappeared from North American agriculture." As they continued examining the materials, Ethan found his perspective on the orchard transforming. Trees he had tended his entire life weren't just family legacy. They were living historical artifacts, the last survivors of genetic lineages developed over centuries of human selection. "We need to document the living trees immediately," Catherine said, already planning their approach. "And we need a botanist specialized in genetic identification to verify these varieties match the historical descriptions. If your trees are truly the last living specimens of these varieties, this changes everything about the foreclosure situation." "How quickly can we establish their significance?" Ethan asked, acutely aware of Reynolds' accelerated timeline. "I have contacts at the National Agricultural Heritage Program," Catherine replied, pulling out her phone. "Dr. Michael Abernathy is their chief botanist for heritage fruit preservation. If anyone can help authenticate this quickly, it's him." While Catherine made calls, Ethan continued examining his grandfather's papers. Among them, he found property surveys with certain areas of the orchard, marked with small stars. Comparing these markings to the catalogue, he realized Walter had created a map of where each rare variety was planted. "Most of these varieties are still exactly where he planted them," Ethan said when Catherine finished her calls. "He created microclimates in different parts of the orchard, south-facing slopes for heat-loving varieties, low areas near the creek for those needing more moisture." Catherine nodded, impressed by Walter's foresight. "That's why they've survived when these varieties failed elsewhere. Your grandfather wasn't just collecting trees, he was creating a perfectly designed conservation orchard." "Dr. Abernathy can be here tomorrow morning," she continued. "He's bringing specialized equipment for DNA sampling and comparison. The National Agricultural Heritage Program takes potential discoveries like this very seriously, especially with a foreclosure threat looming. As they documented the collection throughout the day, Catherine explained how agricultural preservation laws had evolved since Walter's time. In the 1930s, your grandfather would have been considered sentimental for preserving obsolete varieties. Today, the genetic diversity in heritage fruits is recognized as a critical resource, especially as climate change threatens commercial monocultures. By evening, they had identified 28 living trees in the Anderson orchard that potentially matched varieties in the Millstone catalogue. 4 varieties appeared to be missing, possibly lost to severe weather over the decades. Still, 28 living examples of varieties believed extinct represented an extraordinary discovery. We need to keep this quiet until Dr. Abernathy verifies the collection, Catherine cautioned as they finished their initial documentation. If word gets out prematurely, Reynolds might accelerate the foreclosure or find ways to challenge the authentication process. What they couldn't know was that Malcolm Reynolds already suspected something was happening at the Anderson farm. The bank's assessment team, scheduled to begin property evaluation that day, had reported unusual activity. A university vehicle parked by the barn and people examining trees throughout the orchard, taking samples and photographs. Reynolds had immediately made calls to his contacts at the county recorder's office and agricultural extension service, trying to determine what Ethan might have discovered that warranted academic interest just days before foreclosure. His inquiries revealed that Dr. Catherine Chen had cancelled her university commitments for the day, citing urgent fieldwork related to heritage fruit preservation. The connection to heritage preservation immediately raised red flags for Reynolds. His development partners had encountered similar complications on 2 previous projects, where historical designations had derailed profitable conversions of agricultural land to residential developments. He needed to understand exactly what was happening at the Anderson orchard, and quickly. The following morning, Dr. Michael Abernathy arrived from the National Agricultural Heritage Program, his vehicle loaded with specialized equipment for botanical authentication. At 58, the botanist had spent his career documenting and preserving heritage fruit varieties, helping establish protected orchards across the country. "The Millstone Collection," he said with undisguised excitement as Catherine showed him the documentation. "I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Millstone's work using the few catalogue fragments that survived. To find his complete records and potentially living specimens of his varieties is beyond anything I could have hoped for." While Abernathy set up his equipment in the barn, Ethan noticed an unfamiliar vehicle slowly driving past the farm entrance. Through binoculars, he recognized one of Reynolds' assessment team members, clearly monitoring the activity on the property. Reynolds knows something's happening, Ethan told Catherine. "That's the 2nd time they've driven by this morning." "We need to work faster," she replied. "Once Abernathy confirms the authenticity of even a few varieties, we can file for emergency protection under the Heritage Program." Throughout the day, Dr. Abernathy methodically collected samples from trees corresponding to the catalogue descriptions. Using portable equipment, he conducted preliminary genetic analysis, comparing key markers to database references of known heritage varieties. "The preliminary results are extraordinary," he announced by late afternoon, reviewing data on his laptop. "I've confirmed 8 varieties so far that match historical descriptions in ways that cannot be coincidental. The leaf structure, fruit bud formation, and genetic markers all align with documented characteristics." He pulled up an image of molecular analysis alongside historical illustrations. "This Frosthaven variety shows distinctive genetic markers that appear in no other known cultivar. It's not just similar to Millstone's description. It is unquestionably the same apple he documented in 1919, believed completely lost when the last known tree died in 1945. As Abernathy continued his verification work, Catherine helped Ethan Prepare emergency application materials for the National Agricultural Heritage Program. The program could provide immediate protection for orchards containing historically significant varieties, along with funding for their preservation. "We need to document the immediate threat to these trees," Catherine explained. "The combination of foreclosure, imminent development plans, and the irreplaceable nature of these varieties creates a perfect case for emergency intervention." Evening. Abernathy had verified 12 varieties that matched Millstone's catalogue with scientific certainty. "Any one of these trees would merit preservation," he explained as they reviewed his findings. "Together, they represent one of the most significant discoveries in American pomological history in decades." He began drafting an official authentication report, his excitement evident in every precise description. The Heritage Program was literally created for situations like this, where irreplaceable agricultural genetics face imminent destruction. What they didn't realize was that Malcolm Reynolds had spent the day gathering his own information. Through his contacts, he had learned about Dr. Abernathy's affiliation with the National Agricultural Heritage Program and the potential implications for the foreclosure process. By evening, he had scheduled an urgent meeting with Riverview developers to discuss accelerating their timeline. As darkness fell, Ethan walked through his orchard with new awareness of each tree's significance. The gnarled branches of a harvest gold tree, planted by his grandfather nearly a century ago and now confirmed as the last living specimen of its kind, seemed to hold not just apples, but history itself. What had been a failing business venture, that morning had been transformed into a living museum of agricultural heritage by evening. "We've submitted the emergency protection application," Catherine told him, joining his walk through the twilight orchard. "Abernathy's verification carries significant weight. With 12 varieties already confirmed and more pending analysis, we have a strong case for immediate intervention." "How quickly will they respond?" Ethan asked, watching the last light fade. "From his grandfather's trees. The Heritage Program was designed to respond rapidly to imminent threats," she explained. "Given the significance of what we've found, they should assign a case manager within 24 hours. The question is whether that will be soon enough to counter whatever Reynolds might be planning." Catherine's concern proved prescient. The following morning, Ethan received an unexpected letter delivered by courier. Clearwater Agricultural Bank was exercising its right to accelerate the foreclosure timeline due to evidence of material changes to the collateral property. The revised notice demanded full loan repayment within 7 days rather than the original 60, citing a clause in the loan agreement that permitted timeline adjustment if the property was being altered. "This is a direct response to our discovery," Catherine said after reading the notice. "Reynolds is trying to complete the foreclosure before the Heritage Program can establish protection." Dr. Abernathy, continuing his verification work with renewed urgency, looked up from his equipment. "We need to notify the program immediately about this acceleration. This is exactly the kind of situation where they can request a federal stay on foreclosure proceedings pending heritage evaluation." As they scrambled to update their emergency application, a familiar luxury sedan appeared in the farm's driveway. Malcolm Reynolds had decided to make a personal appearance, likely hoping to assess exactly what they had discovered and how it might impact his development plans. "Mr. Anderson," he called with forced cordiality as he approached the barn where they had established their documentation center. "I see you've turned your farm into quite the research station, something I should know about before our foreclosure proceeds." The confrontation that followed would determine not just the fate of the Anderson orchard, but potentially the survival of apple varieties that had persisted against all odds for generations. Living heritage that connected the present to agricultural traditions spanning centuries of American history. Ethan stood squarely in the barn doorway, blocking Malcolm Reynolds' view of the authentication equipment and documentation spread across his grandfather's workbenches. Behind him, Catherine and Dr. Abernathy quickly covered the most revealing materials, including the metal box and original Millstone catalogue. "This is private property, Mr. Reynolds," Ethan said firmly. "At least for the next 7 days, according to your accelerated foreclosure notice." Reynolds smiled thinly, adjusting his designer sunglasses. "Simply doing my due diligence as the primary lien holder, Mr. Anderson. Unusual activity on collateral property naturally raises concerns about asset preservation." His gaze shifted to the rental car with government plates parked nearby. "Federal visitors are particularly noteworthy." "We're conducting agricultural research," Ethan replied, keeping his explanation deliberately vague. "Nothing that violates any terms of the loan agreement." Reynolds' attention fixed on Dr. Abernathy, who had emerged from behind Ethan. "Dr. Michael Abernathy, isn't it? National Agricultural Heritage Program? Your reputation precedes you." The banker's casual name-dropping was calculated to demonstrate his awareness of their activities. "I wasn't aware the Anderson orchard contained anything of interest to your organization. I evaluate numerous properties," Abernathy replied neutrally. "Agricultural genetics is my specialty." Reynolds nodded slowly, processing the implications. "Heritage designations can be complicated processes, I understand, often taking months or even years to finalize, far longer than a standard foreclosure." Timeline. The threat in his observation was thinly veiled. "Some discoveries merit expedited consideration," Catherine interjected, joining them at the barn entrance. "Particularly when they involve irreplaceable agricultural resources facing imminent destruction. Clearwater Agricultural Bank appreciates academic interest in our collateral properties," Reynolds responded smoothly. "However, loan agreements aren't typically affected by research findings, regardless of their scientific interest." "The accelerated foreclosure notice stands." Catherine stepped forward, her academic reserve giving way to direct confrontation. "Mr. Reynolds, are you familiar with the Emergency Protection Clause of the National Agricultural Heritage Conservation Act? It specifically addresses situations where historically significant agricultural genetics face destruction through development or land use changes." Reynolds' expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm familiar with various preservation statutes. I'm also intimately familiar with the specific language in Mr. Anderson's loan agreement, which gives Clearwater comprehensive rights to reclaim our collateral regardless of subsequent discoveries or designations." "That's not entirely accurate," Dr. Abernathy said, his tone shifting from scientific detachment to professional authority. "Federal agricultural heritage statutes can supersede private contracts when unique genetic resources are at stake. My preliminary findings here may very well trigger those protections." For the first time since they'd met him, Reynolds appeared momentarily unsettled. He hadn't anticipated federal involvement with specific knowledge of the relevant regulations. His recovery was quick but noticeable. "Interesting legal theory, Doctor. One that would certainly require extensive litigation to test. Litigation that would extend well beyond any emergency stays your program might impose." His gaze returned to Ethan. "During which time Mr. Anderson would continue accruing legal fees and interest obligations he clearly cannot afford." The implicit message was clear. Even with federal intervention, Reynolds could make the process financially ruinous for Ethan through prolonged legal challenges. "Perhaps we should discuss what Clearwater might consider a reasonable accommodation," Reynolds continued, his tone moderating slightly. "There might be a compromise that allows for some preservation while still permitting the property's development potential to be realized." "I'm listening," Ethan said cautiously. "Riverview developers might be persuaded to incorporate a small heritage orchard section into their residential plan, perhaps 2 acres of selected trees maintained as a community feature. Reynolds proposed this as though offering a significant concession. In exchange for your cooperation with an uncontested foreclosure, of course. Dr. Abernathy shook his head firmly. 2 acres wouldn't preserve the collection's integrity. These varieties require specific microclimates created by the entire orchard's design and positioning. Isolating a few specimens would compromise their long-term viability. Reynolds shrugged slightly. That's our best accommodation. The development. Plans are too far advanced for substantial revision. He checked his watch in a deliberate show of concluding the conversation. You have 7 days to repay the loan in full or accept our transition offer. Heritage research, however interesting, doesn't change those terms. As Reynolds turned to leave, Catherine called after him. You should know we've already submitted an emergency protection application with Dr. Abernathy's preliminary verification of extinct apple varieties found living on this property. The Heritage Program has authority to issue temporary stays against any alterations to the property, including ownership transfers. Reynolds paused, turning back with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Fascinating. Almost as fascinating as the zoning board meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning, where Riverview's application for expedited redesignation of this property from agricultural to residential will be considered. A process that normally takes months, but occasionally moves more quickly when significant economic development is at stake. The revelation stunned them. Reynolds had been working to change the property's zoning classification even before foreclosure was complete, creating another obstacle to preservation. That's highly irregular, Dr. Abernathy noted. Rezoning before completing property acquisition. Merely proper planning, Reynolds countered smoothly. Clearwater maintains excellent relationships with county officials who understand the economic benefits of progressive development. I suggest you focus your preservation efforts on properties with more cooperative owners and less definitive financial outcomes. With that parting comment, Reynolds returned to his sedan, making a phone call before he'd even closed the door. The message was clear. He was mobilizing his considerable resources to counter their preservation efforts. He's accelerating everything, Catherine observed grimly as they watched him drive away. The rezoning application, the shortened foreclosure timeline. He's creating as many obstacles as possible before the Heritage Program can act. Ethan's jaw tightened with resolve. Then we need to work faster too. How many varieties has Dr. Abernathy verified so far? 17 confirmed matches to the Millstone catalogue, the botanist replied, with 5 more showing strong preliminary correlation pending final analysis. 22 potentially extinct varieties preserved on a single property is unprecedented in American agricultural conservation. Will it be enough for emergency intervention? Ethan asked. It should be, Catherine affirmed. But Reynolds is creating a race between banking procedures, zoning changes, and federal conservation protocols, betting that his local influence will move faster than federal mechanisms. Dr. Abernathy was already on his phone, updating the Heritage Program about the accelerated threats. We need a federal representative on site immediately, he explained urgently. Reynolds is creating facts on the ground that will be difficult to reverse once established. What they couldn't know was that Reynolds was implementing a strategy he had refined through previous encounters with preservation efforts. By creating multiple simultaneous challenges, accelerated foreclosure, expedited rezoning, and preliminary development approvals, he was deliberately overwhelming the typically methodical pace of conservation responses. Catherine helped Ethan prepare for the next day's zoning board meeting, knowing their appearance would be fighting an uphill battle against well-established development interests. We need to make them understand what's at stake here isn't just one farm, but irreplaceable agricultural heritage. Will they care? Ethan asked bluntly. Reynolds mentioned economic benefits. The board members are all local business owners who stand to gain from development. Some battles you fight even when the odds are against you, she replied, because the record of your opposition becomes important in subsequent legal challenges. Throughout the afternoon, they continued documenting the orchard and its rare varieties, creating a comprehensive case file for the heritage program. Each verified tree was tagged and photographed, its genetic significance carefully noted alongside historical documentation from the Millstone catalogue. By evening, Ethan's phone rang with an unexpected call from Eleanor Baker, one of the county's oldest residents and the unofficial historian of Riverdale. The elderly woman had learned about the accelerated foreclosure and zoning meeting from her grandson, who worked at the county clerk's office. "Your grandfather saved this community during the worst years of the Dust Bowl," she told Ethan. "When other orchards failed and people were starving, Walter Anderson's trees kept producing because of their drought resistance. He shared everything, never turned away a hungry family." The story was new to Ethan, highlighting another dimension of his grandfather's legacy. "I never knew that. Most people have forgotten," Eleanor continued. "But I haven't. Walter told me once that he planted some trees specifically because they could withstand conditions that would kill modern varieties. Said they might be needed again someday." Her recollection gave Ethan an idea. "Mrs. Baker, would you be willing to come to the zoning board meeting tomorrow? Your perspective on the historical significance of this orchard to the community might help them understand what would be lost." To his relief, she agreed immediately. "Those developers don't know the first thing about this county's history. It's about time someone reminded them." As Ethan shared this development with Catherine and Dr. Abernathy, other calls began coming. In long-time residents who had heard about the threat to the Anderson orchard and wanted to help. The community grapevine, seemingly dormant for years, had suddenly activated around the potential loss of a place many had taken for granted, but now realized represented their shared heritage. "This is exactly what we need," Catherine encouraged. "Local support alongside scientific validation. Reynolds can dismiss federal intervention as outside interference, but he can't as easily ignore community voices." Dr. Abernathy looked up from his analysis equipment with an expression of subdued excitement. "I've completed verification on 20 varieties. This stonehammer apple shows genetic markers for extreme cold hardiness not found in any commercial variety. Its drought resistance combined with cold tolerance could be invaluable for orchards facing climate change." He carefully handled a leaf sample from another tree. "And this Redfield Heritage variety contains natural disease resistance to fire blight that modern breeders have been trying to develop for decades. These aren't just historically interesting apples. They contain genetic traits that could be crucial for future food security." Their documentation continued late into the night, preparing materials for both the zoning board meeting and the heritage program's emergency review. The scientific validation combined with community memories was creating a more compelling case than any of them had initially imagined. The Anderson orchard wasn't just historically significant, but potentially critical for future agricultural resilience. Meanwhile, across town, Malcolm Reynolds was holding an emergency strategy session with Riverview developers and their attorneys. The unexpected discovery at the Anderson farm had created complications, but not insurmountable ones. The accelerated foreclosure and rezoning applications were proceeding, with supportive officials already lined up. "The heritage program can definitely complicate things," Riverview's lead attorney admitted. "But their emergency powers require demonstrating that no other alternative exists for preserving the genetic material." We can argue that specimen trees could be preserved or relocated as part of the development. Reynolds nodded. Keep the focus on economic benefits and tax revenue. Local officials respond to those arguments much more reliably than abstract notions of agricultural preservation. What Reynolds didn't share with his development partners was information he had received from a contact at the Regional Banking Authority. Clearwater's aggressive foreclosure practices were drawing increased regulatory scrutiny. The Anderson property had attracted unwanted attention that could potentially expand into a broader examination of the bank's rural lending practices. As dawn approached, both sides prepared for the zoning board meeting that would represent the first public confrontation over the Anderson orchard's future. Reynolds had arranged for economic development consultants to present projections showing significant tax revenue increases from the proposed Riverdale estates. His carefully cultivated relationships with board members gave him confidence despite the unexpected complications. Ethan had spent the night calling everyone who might support preservation of the orchard. By morning, he had assembled a diverse group ready to attend the zoning meeting. Elderly residents with personal memories of his grandfather's contributions to the community, local farmers concerned about the precedent of agricultural land conversion, and environmental advocates worried about the development's impact on the watershed. Dr. Abernathy had continued working through the night, completing verification of 24 distinct heritage varieties. His findings exceeded even his initial expectations. The Anderson orchard wasn't merely a collection of rare apple varieties, but a living library of genetic traits that modern breeding programs had been trying to replicate for decades. These trees contain natural resistance to diseases, pests, and climate stresses that commercial varieties lack, he explained to Ethan as they prepared for the meeting. The golden russet guardian variety shows remarkable resilience against apple scab that researchers have spent millions trying to develop through conventional breeding. Catherine had assembled this research into a compelling presentation, translating the scientific significance into terms the zoning board members might understand. This isn't just about preserving old trees, she emphasized during their final review. It's about protecting genetic resources that could be essential for the future of American agriculture. As they gathered their materials and prepared to leave for the meeting, Ethan paused in the orchard, touching the rough bark of the harvest gold tree his grandfather had planted nearly a century ago. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save his family farm had transformed into something far more significant. A fight to preserve living agricultural history that connected past generations to future ones. Grandpa knew exactly what he was doing, Ethan said quietly to Catherine as they walked to the car. He wasn't just collecting old apple varieties out of nostalgia. He was deliberately preserving genetic diversity he believed would be needed someday. And he was right, she replied, glancing back at the orchard where morning light filtered through branches laden with developing fruit. We've lost over 80% of the apple varieties that existed in America a century ago. What your grandfather preserved here might be irreplaceable. As they drove toward town, they noticed something unexpected: cars and trucks parked along the county road near the farm entrance. People were gathering, many holding handmade signs with messages like "Save the Anderson Heritage Orchard" and "Protect our agricultural legacy." News of the zoning meeting and the threat to the historic orchard had spread throughout the community overnight, mobilizing supporters they hadn't even contacted. Local farmers had brought their families, longtime residents stood chatting with. Environmental activists and several news outlets had sent reporters to cover what had suddenly become a significant community story. Word travels fast in small towns, Ethan said, emotion catching in his throat as he saw neighbors he hadn't spoken with in years holding signs supporting his farm. Catherine smiled. Reynolds may have banking connections and developer resources, but he underestimated something more powerful, a community's attachment to its heritage. This isn't just your fight anymore, Ethan. These people are standing up for something they've just realized matters deeply to them. The unexpected community. Support represented a significant shift in the dynamics of the confrontation. Reynolds had carefully cultivated influence with officials and business leaders, but public opinion, especially when mobilized around preservation of local heritage, could change political calculations rapidly. As they parked at the county administration building, they could see the crowd of supporters growing, now joined by agricultural students from the state university who had arrived in vans with their professors. Dr. Abernathy's colleagues had spread word through academic channels, bringing additional scientific expertise to support the preservation effort. Inside, the normally quiet meeting room was filled to capacity, with Reynolds and the Riverview representatives looking increasingly uncomfortable as preservation supporters continued to arrive. The zoning board members exchanged concerned glances, clearly unprepared for the public interest their usually routine meeting had generated. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of the Anderson orchard, but potentially establish a precedent for how agricultural heritage would be valued against development pressures throughout the region. As the board chairman called the meeting to order, both Ethan and Reynolds prepared to make their cases in what had suddenly become a very public battle over the future of a legacy that had waited patiently for decades to reveal its true significance. Riverdale County Administration Building rarely saw crowds exceeding a dozen citizens for zoning meetings. This morning, over 200 people packed the main chamber, with more gathered in the hallway outside, straining to hear through open doors. Chairman George Wilson, a third-generation hardware store owner who had served on the zoning board for 15 years, surveyed the unexpected audience with visible discomfort. Given the unusual public interest in today's proceedings, Wilson began, adjusting his microphone nervously, we'll be modifying our standard format to accommodate more community input. However, I must remind everyone that this hearing concerns a specific zoning application, not general discussions about property ownership or foreclosure matters. This preliminary attempt to narrow the scope of discussion was clearly aimed at limiting testimony about the orchard's historical significance. A.E. Procedural maneuver likely orchestrated through Reynolds' earlier communications with board members. Malcolm Reynolds sat confidently at the applicant's table, flanked by Riverview development executives and their legal counsel. Their polished presentation materials and matching folders created a stark visual contrast with Ethan's hastily assembled documents and supporters. We'll begin with the applicant's presentation, Wilson announced, nodding toward Reynolds. The banker rose smoothly, buttoning his tailored suit jacket as he approached the presentation screen. Chairman Wilson, board members, thank you for accommodating. A request for expedited consideration. Riverdale Estates represents a transformative economic opportunity for this community. For the next 15 minutes, Reynolds and his team delivered a meticulously choreographed presentation highlighting tax revenue projections, job creation estimates, and property value enhancements surrounding the proposed development. Digital renderings showed luxurious homes nestled among carefully landscaped grounds, with a small section labeled Heritage Orchard Park, featuring a handful of apple trees around a decorative gazebo. We recognize the Anderson property has certain historical associations, Reynolds acknowledged with practiced sincerity, which is why our plan incorporates preservation of selected specimen trees within a dedicated public space. This balanced approach honors agricultural heritage while embracing economic progress essential for Riverdale's future. Board members. nodded appreciatively as Reynolds detailed infrastructure improvements Riverview would fund, road expansions, water system upgrades, and enhanced emergency services access. Each point was calculated to address municipal pain points that limited county budgets had left unresolved for years. As Reynolds concluded, Wilson turned to Ethan. "Mr. Anderson, you've requested time to address the board regarding this application. Please keep your comments focused on zoning considerations, not ownership disputes currently under separate legal proceedings." Ethan approached the podium, visibly nervous but determined. Unlike Reynolds, he wore work clothes, clean but bearing the faint stains of honest labor that no amount of washing could completely remove. Catherine joined him, carrying their presentation materials. "Thank you for allowing me to speak," Ethan began. "I'm not here to dispute Clearwater Bank's loan proceedings, but to provide critical information about the property being considered for rezoning, information that directly affects its appropriate land use classification." He nodded to Catherine, who loaded their presentation onto the display screen. The first image showed Walter Anderson's metal box and the Millstone catalog documentation. "3 days ago, I discovered something my grandfather deliberately preserved. On our farm, something that fundamentally changes the property's significance beyond ordinary agricultural land." For the next 10 minutes, Ethan and Catherine alternated explaining their discovery, showing images of the rare apple varieties alongside their historical documentation. Dr. Abernathy provided scientific context, explaining genetic verification, methods that confirmed the tree's unique characteristics and extinct status. "This isn't merely a sentimental appeal," Dr. Abernathy emphasized. "The Anderson orchard contains living specimens of 24 apple varieties believed extinct since the 1930s. These trees preserve genetic traits for disease resistance, climate adaptability, and nutritional profiles absent from modern commercial varieties." Eleanor Baker, the 92-year-old county historian, spoke next, her voice wavering but powerful as she recounted Walter Anderson's role during the Dust Bowl years. "When other orchards failed and families went hungry, Walter's trees produced food that sustained this entire community. Those weren't just any apple trees, they were varieties specifically selected to withstand conditions that destroyed other crops." As their presentation continued, the mood in the room noticeably shifted. Board members who had begun with polite but distant expressions now leaned forward, engaged by the unexpected historical and scientific significance being revealed. The National Agricultural Heritage Program has initiated emergency review of this site, Dr. Abernathy continued, displaying official documentation. "Preliminary findings already confirm its exceptional importance to American agricultural genetics. We're requesting the board delay rezoning consideration pending completion of the federal heritage evaluation." Reynolds interrupted, rising from his seat with controlled urgency. "Chairman Wilson, while these historical anecdotes are certainly interesting, they have minimal relevance to zoning considerations. The applicant has already accommodated preservation concerns through the Heritage Orchard section of our development plan." Before Wilson could respond, the chamber doors opened to admit 2 new arrivals, a man and woman in professional attire carrying federal government credentials. They approached the podium as whispers spread through the audience. Dr. Diana Rivera, director of the National Agricultural Heritage Program. The woman introduced herself, presenting her identification to Chairman Wilson. "This is James Morrison, our legal counsel. We're here regarding the Anderson property currently under discussion." Reynolds's composed demeanor flickered briefly before he regained control. The federal intervention he had feared had arrived sooner than anticipated. "Chairman Wilson, board members," Dr. Rivera continued, "yesterday our office received an emergency protection application regarding the Anderson orchard. Our preliminary review of documentation submitted by Dr. Abernathy meets threshold requirements for immediate action under the Heritage Conservation Act. She handed official documents to the board secretary. This serves as formal notification that the Anderson property has been placed under temporary protection status pending full evaluation. This federal designation temporarily suspends any zoning changes, ownership transfers, or physical alterations to the property for 45 days. The announcement sent murmurs through the audience. Reynolds immediately consulted with his legal team, their urgent whispers barely concealed behind cupped hands. Furthermore, Morrison added, we've filed concurrent notification with Clearwater Agricultural Bank regarding suspension of their foreclosure proceedings on this property for the same period. Federal courts have consistently upheld Heritage Program authority to temporarily freeze financial actions that could result in destruction of protected agricultural genetics. This dual intervention, halting both the rezoning and foreclosure processes simultaneously, represented precisely the scenario Reynolds had been racing to prevent. His carefully orchestrated timeline had been designed to complete both actions before federal mechanisms could engage. This is regulatory overreach, Reynolds objected, approaching the podium. Clearwater has valid contractual rights that predate any heritage considerations. The proposed development already accommodates preservation through our heritage orchard section. Dr. Rivera turned toward him with professional courtesy, masking unmistakable authority. Mr. Reynolds, we've reviewed Riverview's proposal. Transplanting or isolating a few specimen trees fails to preserve the genetic integrity of this collection. These varieties exist as a functioning ecosystem, with specific microclimates created by the orchard's overall design and placement. She displayed a thermal imaging map of the Anderson property. Our preliminary analysis indicates that Walter Anderson deliberately positioned these varieties to create temperature gradients, wind buffers, and moisture retention patterns that protect sensitive cultivars. The entire property functions as an integrated conservation system, not simply a collection of individual trees. This scientific validation of Walter's design intentions visibly affected board members who had likely perceived the orchard as merely an outdated agricultural operation rather than a deliberately engineered conservation project 7 decades ahead of its time. Chairman Wilson, recognizing the shifting dynamics, attempted to regain procedural control. Given this federal intervention, it appears the board must table this rezoning application pending resolution of the heritage evaluation process. Reynolds made one final attempt to salvage his timeline. Chairman Wilson, federal designation isn't guaranteed simply because a temporary review has been initiated. I propose the board conditionally approve the rezoning, effective upon completion of the heritage review if protection is denied. This procedural maneuver would essentially pre-approve development should the federal protection ultimately be rejected, giving Reynolds a significant advantage in subsequent proceedings. Wilson looked uncertain, clearly weighing the community's visible support for preservation against long-established relationships with development interests. The chamber fell silent as board members exchanged glances, sensing the historic significance of their decision. At that moment, an elderly man rose from the audience, Robert Garcia, a retired county commissioner known for his institutional knowledge and integrity. Mr. Chairman, if I may address procedural precedent, our bylaws specifically prohibit conditional zoning approvals when federal reviews are pending. This board established that policy in 1994 precisely to prevent predetermining outcomes of higher jurisdictional processes. The citation of specific procedural rules from a respected former official left Wilson with little maneuvering room. Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Garcia. In light of federal action and our established procedures, this application is Tabled for 45 days, pending heritage evaluation outcomes. The gavel's sharp crack formalized the decision, bringing the first public confrontation to a clear resolution in Ethan's favor. The temporary reprieve would provide crucial time for complete documentation and evaluation of the orchard's significance. As the meeting adjourned, supporters surrounded Ethan, offering congratulations and sharing personal memories of his grandfather and the orchard. The community connection to this heritage had awakened with unexpected vigor, transforming what had begun as one farmer's desperate last stand into a collective effort to preserve shared agricultural history. Reynolds did not join the impromptu celebration, instead conferring intensely with his legal team in a corner of the chamber. The banker's expression betrayed rare frustration. Federal intervention had disrupted his carefully structured timeline, but the battle was far from over. His gaze met Ethan's briefly across the room, conveying silent determination that this setback was merely temporary. Outside the administration building, Catherine embraced Ethan in spontaneous celebration. "This is exactly what we needed. Time to complete proper documentation and verification. The Heritage Program doesn't issue temporary protections lightly. They clearly recognize the collection's significance." Dr. Rivera approached them as reporters, gathered nearby, sensing a story that transcended local interest. "Mr. Anderson, we have a team of botanists and agricultural historians arriving tomorrow to begin comprehensive documentation. Your grandfather created something truly remarkable, potentially the most important single-site apple genetics repository in the country." "Will 45 days be enough?" Ethan asked, aware that Reynolds would use every available resource to challenge the designation. "For preliminary protection, yes," she assured him. "Comprehensive designation takes longer, but once we document the full extent of the collection, continued protection becomes much more likely. These initial findings already exceed significance thresholds for the National Registry of Agricultural Heritage Sites." As they discussed next steps, Ethan noticed Reynolds exiting the building, phone pressed to his ear as he issued instructions with clipped precision. The banker's confident stride suggested he was already developing alternative strategies to achieve his objectives despite this setback. "This isn't over," Ethan observed quietly. "Reynolds has too much invested in this development to abandon it easily." Dr. Abernathy nodded in agreement. "The Heritage Program can delay proceedings and scientifically document significance, but permanent protection requires demonstrating ongoing viability. We need to show this orchard isn't just historically important, but sustainable for the future." This observation highlighted the critical distinction between temporary intervention and permanent protection. The former could be achieved through scientific and historical documentation. The latter required demonstrating economic sustainability, precisely where Ethan had been struggling before discovering his grandfather's hidden legacy. "That's our next challenge," Catherine acknowledged, "proving these heritage varieties aren't just scientifically valuable, but economically viable in today's agricultural marketplace." As they returned to the farm that afternoon, federal team members were already arriving, botanists, historians, and documentation specialists dispatched with remarkable speed. The National Agricultural Heritage Program had clearly prioritized the Anderson Orchard case, allocating significant resources to its evaluation. Dr. Rivera explained their unusually rapid response as they toured the property. "We've lost so many heritage agricultural sites to development before their significance could be properly documented. Your grandfather's collection represents exactly the kind of irreplaceable genetic repository our program was created to protect." While federal specialists began their meticulous documentation process, cataloging each tree and its historical provenance, Ethan found himself drawn back to his grandfather's workshop. The metal box had yielded its immediate secrets, but something About Walter's journal entries suggested there might be more information yet undiscovered. Returning to the leather journal, Ethan carefully reread entries from the 1930s, noting references to marketing studies and commercial applications that seemed disconnected from the preservation narrative. His grandfather had been not just a preservationist but a practical farmer. He would have considered the economic potential of these varieties, not merely their historical significance. As evening approached, Catherine found Ethan in the workshop, surrounded by his grandfather's journals and notes. Federal team has already verified 28 distinct varieties. They're calling it the most significant apple genetics discovery in decades. Ethan looked up from a journal entry he'd been studying intently. Grandpa wasn't just preserving these apples because they were rare. He documented specific commercial applications for each variety: disease-resistant cider apples, long-storing culinary varieties, and what he called specialty dessert fruits with unique flavor profiles. He showed her the detailed notes Walter had compiled on potential markets for heritage varieties, notes that had seemed irrelevant during the era of agricultural standardization but appeared remarkably prescient in today's farm-to-table artisanal food renaissance. He wasn't just saving these varieties for some distant future when they might be appreciated, Ethan realized. He was creating a business plan that was 70 years ahead of its time, waiting for markets to recognize the value these forgotten fruits could offer. This revelation transformed their understanding of Walter's project from purely preservationist to entrepreneurial foresight. The orchard wasn't simply a living museum. It was a dormant business opportunity designed by someone who had anticipated how agricultural markets would eventually rediscover what standardization had sacrificed. As federal teams continued their scientific documentation throughout the property, this economic dimension added critical weight to their preservation case. The Anderson orchard could potentially demonstrate not just historical significance, but contemporary viability, the crucial component for securing permanent protection. What none of them realized was that Reynolds was already implementing his contingency strategy. While federal intervention had temporarily halted foreclosure and rezoning processes, the banker was exploring alternative pressure points that might circumvent these protections. His next move would target vulnerabilities even federal designation couldn't address, forcing them to prove the orchard's economic viability faster than they had anticipated. The temporary victory at the zoning board had bought precious time, but the fundamental challenge remained: transforming Walter Anderson's visionary preservation work into a sustainable enterprise that could justify permanent protection. The clock was now ticking on their 45-day reprieve, during which they needed to demonstrate not just the orchard's historical importance, but its future potential. 2 weeks after the zoning board meeting, the Anderson orchard had transformed into a hive of scientific activity. Botanical specialists methodically documented each heritage variety, geneticists extracted DNA samples for comprehensive analysis, and historians meticulously correlated Walter's notes with agricultural records from the 1920s and 30s. The preliminary protection status had created a temporary sanctuary where the orchard's significance could be properly assessed without the immediate threat of development. Ethan stood beneath the sprawling branches of a crimson winter tree, watching Dr. Rivera and her team carefully map its location relative to surrounding varieties. The federal response had exceeded his most optimistic expectations, bringing world-class expertise to validate what his grandfather had quietly preserved for generations. Your grandfather understood microclimates with remarkable precision, Dr. Rivera observed, consulting thermal imaging displays on her tablet. These temperature gradient maps show how he positioned cold-sensitive varieties in protected pockets created by more resilient trees. It's sophisticated botanical engineering that predates modern computer modeling, Catherine joined them, carrying printouts of Walter's hand-drawn orchard maps from the 1930s. "We've been overlaying your grandfather's original designs with current imaging. The correlation is extraordinary. He created deliberate wind tunnels, frost pockets, and moisture retention zones that optimize conditions for each variety." This scientific validation of Walter's methods was deeply gratifying, but Ethan's attention had increasingly focused on his grandfather's economic notes. While federal specialists documented the orchard's historical and genetic significance, he and Catherine had been piecing together Walter's vision for the commercial potential of these heritage varieties. Grandpa identified specific applications for each apple type, Ethan explained, showing Dr. Rivera a meticulously organized chart he'd compiled from scattered journal entries. The amber russet for artisanal cider production, the winter. Keeper for its extraordinary storage qualities, the crimson spice for distinctive culinary applications. Dr. Rivera studied the chart with increasing interest. This strengthens our case considerably. Heritage protection is more readily secured when historic significance aligns with contemporary value. Your grandfather wasn't just preserving genetic material, he was banking agricultural potential for future markets. Despite this encouraging progress, a new challenge had emerged 3 days earlier when Malcolm Reynolds unveiled his countermove. Unable to proceed with foreclosure or rezoning during the federal review period, the banker had activated alternative pressure through the county water authority. "I've just received confirmation," Reynolds had announced during a hastily organized press conference. "The independent engineering assessment commissioned by Clearwater Bank confirms critical infrastructure deficiencies in the county water system, deficiencies that would be remediated through the Riverdale Estates development." By reframing the development as essential infrastructure improvement rather than merely luxury housing, Reynolds had created a new narrative that circumvented heritage considerations. The accompanying report detailed how the aging water system, serving the Western County, including the Anderson Orchard, required substantial upgrades that county budgets couldn't fund. Riverdale Estates includes comprehensive water system modernization that benefits the entire community, Reynolds had emphasized to assembled reporters. While we respect the heritage review process, these infrastructure improvements cannot be indefinitely delayed without risking system failures affecting hundreds of families. This strategic pivot had immediate impact, shifting public discussion from preservation versus development to necessary infrastructure versus heritage interests. Reynolds had effectively created urgency around water system improvements that only his development could fund, placing new pressure on officials supporting the orchard's protection. The Water Authority had subsequently announced temporary conservation measures that particularly affected agricultural users. Irrigation restrictions would be imposed during the critical summer months, with priority given to residential use. For the Anderson Orchard, these restrictions could potentially undermine the health of the heritage trees during the hottest, driest period of the year. "It's a clever move," Catherine acknowledged, as they discussed this development in the barn. "Reynolds can't directly challenge the federal protection, so he's created conditions that could damage the orchard while appearing to address legitimate community concerns." Dr. Abernathy nodded grimly. "The heritage program can prevent development of the property, but it has limited authority regarding water allocation policies. If these trees experience significant stress during the protection period, it could undermine our case for permanent designation." Ethan studied the county water system map, noting how the main line ran directly through his property. "Grandpa always said our water access was secure because the primary county line crosses our land. There's an easement agreement somewhere in the old files." This observation prompted a search through Walter's legal papers, eventually yielding a 1943 document. That proved more significant than they initially realized. The easement agreement granted the county perpetual access to maintain the waterline crossing Anderson property, but with a crucial provision. In consideration for said easement, the Anderson farm shall maintain priority agricultural water. Access in perpetuity, limited only by general conservation measures, applying equally to all agricultural users in the district. This directly contradicts the Water Authority's proposed restrictions, Catherine said excitedly. They can't legally impose special limitations on your irrigation without violating this binding agreement. While this discovery provided potential legal leverage against Reynolds' water restriction strategy, Ethan recognized that playing defensive legal games wouldn't secure the orchard's long-term future. We need to do more than just protect these trees. We need to prove they're economically viable in today's market, just as Grandpa envisioned. That realization sparked an intensive exploration of Walter's commercial notes, revealing remarkably prescient market analysis. His grandfather had documented specific qualities that made each variety commercially distinctive: flavor profiles, storage capacities, disease resistance, and culinary applications that industrial apple production had sacrificed for standardization and shelf appearance. These notes read like a blueprint for today's artisanal food movement, Catherine observed, reviewing Walter's detailed descriptions. The Honeycrisp apple wasn't developed until decades after these notes, but your grandfather was already identifying the market potential for apples with complex flavor profiles and distinctive characteristics. With Dr. Rivera's encouragement, they began contacting specialty food producers, heritage cuisine chefs, and craft beverage makers to gauge market interest in the unique varieties. The response exceeded their expectations, revealing substantial demand for precisely the characteristics these forgotten apples offered. As Ethan and Catherine pursued this market research, an unexpected discovery in Walter's files transformed their understanding of the water system controversy. In a folder labeled Community Water System Original Surveys were engineering documents from the 1940s detailing the original county water system design, documents showing something significant about the infrastructure Reynolds claimed required. Complete overhaul. The main filtration system was originally built on Anderson land, Ethan realized, studying the yellowing blueprints. Grandpa granted that easement too, but there's another provision here about maintenance responsibilities. The agreement clearly stated that the county was obligated to maintain filtration capacity at specified levels, with failure to perform routine maintenance invalidating exclusive control of the system. Historical maintenance records Catherine obtained through university connections revealed systemic neglect over decades, precisely the deficiencies Reynolds was now citing as justification for development-funded improvements. This changes the entire infrastructure narrative, Dr. Abernathy observed. The system doesn't require complete redevelopment. It needs proper maintenance that was contractually required but never performed. That's significantly less expensive than Reynolds' proposal suggests. An elderly county employee named Howard Jenkins, who had worked for the Water Authority for over 30 years, provided crucial context when Catherine contacted him about the original system design. Walter Anderson didn't just grant easements for the water system, Jenkins explained. He actually helped design filtration features integrated with the orchard's layout. Jenkins described how Walter had worked with county engineers to create natural filtration systems that utilized the orchard's soil composition and drainage patterns to enhance water quality before it reached municipal processing. The trees weren't just growing apples. They were part of a sophisticated natural filtration system that supplemented mechanical processing. This revelation stunned them. Walter Anderson hadn't merely preserved rare apple varieties, He had designed the entire orchard as an integrated environmental system that served multiple functions, including enhancing the county's water infrastructure through natural filtration and aquifer recharge. Your grandfather was practicing what we now call green infrastructure, 7 decades before it became an environmental engineering concept, Dr. Rivera explained, examining the original designs. He recognized that agricultural land could serve multiple functions simultaneously: food production, genetic preservation, and ecosystem services like water purification. The implications were profound. Reynolds had portrayed the orchard as an obstacle to infrastructure improvement, but Walter's design suggested the opposite. The heritage trees were actually part of the water system's intended function, providing natural services that would be expensive to replace with conventional engineering solutions. With this new understanding, Ethan and Catherine organized a community open house at the orchard, inviting county officials, water engineers, local historians, and media representatives. The event would showcase both the heritage apple collection and the previously unrecognized infrastructure functions the orchard provided. The turnout exceeded their expectations. Hundreds of community members wandered among the heritage trees, learning about their historical significance and genetic importance from federal specialists. Local chefs and food producers offered tastings of products created with last season's heritage apples, demonstrating their culinary and commercial value. Most significantly, environmental engineers presented analysis of how the orchard's design enhanced water filtration, creating displays that illustrated the green infrastructure functions Walter had incorporated decades before the concept existed in modern planning. County commissioners listened with growing interest as experts explained how natural systems could provide water quality benefits at a fraction of the cost of conventional infrastructure. Howard Jenkins, now retired, addressed the gathering with personal recollections. During the drought of 1976, this orchard's integrated water management system continued functioning when neighboring counties faced water quality emergencies. Walter Anderson understood something fundamental about working with natural systems rather than replacing them. The community response was overwhelmingly positive, with local media coverage highlighting the multiple dimensions of Walter's vision, preserving irreplaceable genetic diversity while enhancing community infrastructure through innovative design. The narrative Reynolds had crafted began unraveling as public understanding of the orchard's true functions expanded beyond heritage apples to include vital environmental services. County commissioners, sensing the shifting public sentiment, announced the formation of a special committee to review water system management and explore how the orchard's natural filtration functions could be incorporated into future planning. The Water Authority suspended its proposed agricultural restrictions pending comprehensive assessment of existing infrastructure design. This public relations setback was the beginning of Reynolds's retreat. His carefully constructed narrative had relied on positioning development against sentimentality, progress against preservation. The revelation that the orchard actually constituted sophisticated green infrastructure undermined his central argument that development represented the community's best interest. Clearwater Bank's regional headquarters, already uncomfortable with the regulatory attention the Anderson case had attracted, summoned Reynolds for consultation after media coverage of the open house reached financial industry publications. His accelerated foreclosure tactics and collaboration with developers before completing property acquisition raised compliance concerns that prompted internal review. Inspirational music transition as we move forward 6 months. 6 months after, discovering the metal box in his grandfather's barn, Ethan stood among blossoming apple trees, watching as visitors explored the newly established Walter Anderson Heritage Center. The faded barn had been restored with funding from the National Agricultural Heritage Program, its interior transformed into educational space where visitors learned about genetic preservation, environmental design, and agricultural history. "I still can't believe how much has changed," Catherine said, joining him beneath the crimson winter tree. Now serving as the center's educational director, she had helped develop programs that brought school groups, university researchers, and culinary professionals to the orchard throughout the year. From foreclosure to National Heritage Site in half a year, Ethan agreed, watching a group of agricultural students learning grafting techniques from Dr. Abernathy. Grandpa would be amazed by how many people care about what he preserved. The National Agricultural Heritage Program had granted permanent protection status to the Anderson Orchard, designating it their first living agricultural heritage laboratory, a new classification that recognized sites where historic preservation aligned with contemporary research and education. The designation included substantial funding for maintenance, research, and educational programming that had transformed the farm's economic outlook. Dr. Rivera approached, carrying preliminary economic projections for the orchard's new operational model. "The specialty market partnerships are exceeding expectations," she reported. "Craft cideries are contracting your entire production of heritage cider varieties at 5 times standard market rates, and the culinary variety contracts with specialty restaurants are similarly profitable. Most significantly, the licensing agreement for the fire blight resistance genetics discovered in the Stonehammer variety promised sustainable income for generations." Cornell University's agricultural program had established a research partnership that would eventually introduce this natural disease resistance into commercial breeding programs, generating ongoing royalties that would support the orchard's preservation in perpetuity. "The genetic licensing alone ensures financial stability," Catherine noted, "but the integrated business model is what makes this truly sustainable. Specialty crop sales, educational programming, research partnerships, and ecosystem services. Payments from the County Water Authority. This last element represented perhaps the most surprising outcome of their journey. Once the orchard's role in water filtration was fully documented, the county had established an ecosystem services payment program that compensated the Heritage Center for the natural infrastructure functions it provided. Recognizing the economic value of services previously taken for granted, Reynolds had departed Riverdale County shortly after Clearwater Bank reassigned him to their compliance department, a bureaucratic exile from which his career would likely never recover. The regulatory scrutiny triggered by the Anderson case had expanded into a broader examination of the bank's rural lending practices, revealing patterns of accelerated foreclosures on agricultural properties with development potential. Riverview. Developers had withdrawn their housing proposal entirely, pivoting to more conventional projects without the complications of contested heritage claims. Their public statements emphasized commitment to community-appropriate development that respects local heritage, corporate language, acknowledging their miscalculation in challenging the orchard's significance. The most personal transformation had been Ethan's own relationship with his family's legacy. The farm that had seemed an overwhelming burden now represented his connection to a visionary ancestor whose work had proven remarkably prescient. Managing the Heritage Center demanded different skills than conventional farming, but the sense of purpose far exceeded anything commercial agriculture had offered. As the day's visitors departed and evening approached, Ethan returned to his grandfather's workshop in the restored barn. The hidden compartment that had protected the metal box now stood open as part of the historical exhibit, its secret purpose fulfilled after decades of patient waiting. Carefully, Ethan placed the box back in its original hiding place, adding a new journal documenting the remarkable events of the past 6 months. Future generations would find not only Walter's preservation work, but the story of its rediscovery and validation, a continuing narrative of agricultural heritage protected through individual foresight and collective recognition of its irreplaceable value. Outside, the heritage apple trees stood bathed in golden evening light, their gnarled branches beginning to form the first tiny fruits of the season. The orchard had survived not just by chance, but through the deliberate vision of a man who understood that some treasures must be protected against the short-sightedness of conventional wisdom, preserved until the moment when their true value could be recognized. What appears to be lost is sometimes simply waiting to be rediscovered. Walter Anderson's legacy reminds us that true foresight means planting seeds whose fruits you may never personally harvest, preserving treasures that future generations will need long after you're gone. When Ethan opened that mysterious package left by his grandfather, he didn't just save a family farm, he reconnected an entire community with living heritage that had been quietly waiting for the right moment to reveal its true purpose. If this story touched your heart, hit the subscribe button for more tales of forgotten legacies and hidden treasures waiting to be discovered. Remember, in a world that too often values only immediate returns, the most important inheritance might be the wisdom to protect what seems forgotten until its time comes again.